Interested in the well-being of your organization? Do you find it difficult to know where to start or how your existing well-being offering is working? We have worked with experts to create holistic well-being solutions suitable for organizations at any stage, including our unique Being Well Together program, the integrated solution for all your health, safety, and well-being needs. Our research indicates that only 49% of companies have a written well-being strategy, and most of those do not measure effectiveness. Our range of solutions help you to identify gaps in well-being provision, providing clear guidance on how you can address them. Becoming a supporter of the Being Well Together program means access to tools and resources, allowing you to effectively develop and implement a health, safety, and well-being strategy in a joined-up, holistic way. You will see the health and well-being of your workforce improve and make the most of your investments. The Being Well Together program is available from British Safety Council or Mates in Mind, both registered charities.
Introduce our two speakers that we have for today. First of all, we have Marcus Herbert from British Safety Council. Marcus is he's the head of wellbeing here at BSC. Marcus has over 15 years experience and 2 degrees in the wellbeing industry. He's worked with individuals, elite athletes and executives on enhancing their own personal wellbeing and reducing their risk of lifestyle diseases through effective behaviour change strategies. Transferring this experience into the corporate setting, Marcus has worked with organisations from micro to global on their approach to organisational well-being and how to develop an effective and meaningful well-being strategy. More recently, Marcus has developed training courses to support directors, line managers and employees on the most effective ways to embrace health and well-being at work. Our second speaker is Simon Taylor. Simon is Head of Corporate Wellbeing at York Mind. As the head of York Mind's Corporate Wellbeing Services Department, Simon oversees the strategic direction and ongoing delivery and development of a range of services aimed at supporting employers to improve their mental health in the workplace. As a member of the senior leadership team, Simon has also strategic and operational oversight of the charity as a whole and contributes to decision-making alongside the CEO and other departments. I'll now hand over to Marcus, who will set the scene for today's webinar. Over to you, Marcus.
And yeah, just Simon, thanks so much for joining us today for the presentation talking about stress. I think I actually will benefit from your talk myself personally, with this queue of 100-odd people standing right behind my laptop. And so yeah, Simon's been invited to deliver a talk today based on his expertise and what he's doing at the moment within York Mind. I won't be delivering on this webinar today. I'll be joining the Q&A towards the end. So Simon, without further ado, I will hand over to you, and thanks very much.
Perfect, thank you. I'm hoping in a second everyone will be able to see my screen. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us. Perfect.
Yeah, we can see your screen, Simon.
Perfect.
Just not the slides yet.
No, great.
There we go.
How's that?
So it's showing us in presenter mode at the moment. So we can see the current slide and we can see the next slide as well. But if you,
sure.
along the top, if you select display settings, you should be able to change that.
Perfect. That should be working now.
There we go. Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, yeah, thanks everyone for joining. As Marcus mentioned there, my name's Simon Taylor. I am Head of Corporate Wellbeing for York Mind. So yeah, I have a few roles within the organisation, but in particular, it's developing new services for our provision within York specifically. So yeah, my main kind of areas of expertise, I've got a background in physiology, coaching, charity management, and I kind of bring all those together to develop programs. So any questions, feel free to direct those into the chat. Just a little bit on what we're going to be covering today. So hopefully you get a little bit from the title, Managing Organisational Stress in a Stressful World. I think we can all agree that stress levels are increasing overall in the UK and globally at the minute. So what we're going to hopefully cover today is a few things around what exactly is stress. We'll cover a model of stress and how we can use that model to understand different types of interventions to make sure that we can support everyone across a whole organisation and different types of people in different situations. And there's going to be 3 tiers, so that there's going to be supportive interventions, preventative interventions, and educational interventions. And then we'll also look about how we get those interventions and implement them into the organisation to start to change the culture of the organisation. And we'll finish off with some kind of last-minute tips. So just really to start things off and set the scene, I wanted to just put a few statistics in here around specifically mental health and the impact that has on organisations. We know that particularly stress and anxiety, depression and anxiety, those are the 2 most common mental health conditions currently across the UK and globally as well. And we know about half the working days that are lost are due to these conditions, and we know that they can be triggered by stress. There's a huge annual cost of mental health conditions, looking around about the 33 to 24 billion pounds per year. And we know that 15% of people in the workplace have symptoms of an existing mental health condition. So these are some really, really interesting statistics, and it certainly starts to build a case for why we need to start understanding stress as a trigger for mental health problems, specifically within the working environment. So a really good place for us to start here is what actually is stress. People on this call today may have experienced stress themselves, and if you have a think about what does stress mean to you? What it means to Lazarus et al. In 1985, this group of researchers came up with this definition, and I really, really like this definition. I'll tell you why. What it's essentially saying here is that stress occurs when someone's demands, or perceived demands, that's really important, are essentially out of kilter with their ability to meet those demands. So what we can imagine here is that we've got essentially kind of 3 situations which we can be in. And once again, think about which one of these you feel yourself in at any one time. This can change. So if you're in the green, that means that your demands are lower than your ability to cope with those demands. It's all about that balance between those 2 things. Demands could be things like things at home. There could be workload. There's lots of things that could increase that kind of figure out, I guess, on the bar chart. And then we've got our coping skills as well. So everyone's coping skills are going to be slightly different. That could be things like exercise, sleep, generally looking after our well-being, our workload, and how much time we have on our hands. So what we see here is that a lot of people tend to find themselves either in the amber or in the red categories. If you're in the green, great. That means that your coping skills are high, your demands may be a little bit lower. But what we tend to see is that actually someone, particularly in the middle, has a balance between their demands and coping, but they're kind of equal in a sense. And what that means is that that's great. It's unlikely you're going to be experiencing high levels of stress in this situation. But what it does mean is that any one event could tip you in either direction. So, for example, if your demands and coping are pretty kind of level, but then something happens at work, a new project comes along, or something happens at home where that your attention is needed there, suddenly those demands increase. We could look at it from a slightly different perspective and say, let's say exercise is one of my key coping strategies, but I get an injury. Suddenly my coping levels have gone down and we're starting to tip into the red. So if you're in that category and you're thinking, yeah, that's me, something to be aware of. And then we've got someone on the red where our demands are just way higher than our ability to cope with them. And this person is likely to be experiencing stress. Now, we know that stress is generally considered as an acute phenomenon. So, we've got that kind of acute levels of stress where we get the rush of adrenaline, but we can get sustained stress over a long period of time as a result of our demands versus our coping. And when we start to see that, we call it burnout. So, you can see on the graph just here, I guess I'll start off with the definition of what actually is burnout. Burnout is a chronic, it's a result of chronic stress. So when we accumulate stress over a long period of time, we get to a point where we can no longer deal with that stress. The demands have completely surpassed our ability to cope with them for such a long period of time that we reach this sort of pinch point. So again, if we look on the graph just there, stress levels increase, increase, increase. What we would ideally want to do with that, and this is something we want to consider from an organisational standpoint as well, is at the point where we start to notice, yes, our stress levels are increasing and we're not really getting that opportunity to put things in place to cope or to reduce those demands, that's the point where we want to do something. So we want to put stress management strategies in place. We want to look at our workload. We want to look at what coping skills could we develop. Again, on an organisational level, this works, but also on an individual level as well. As we start to increase, let's say we've ignored that, we're going to keep going, stress levels are going to keep building, and we're going to get to that pinch point that I mentioned. So at that point, you may know someone who's experienced burnout, you may have experienced it yourself, but we tend to find that people essentially have a forced intervention, if we want to call it that. So they are forced to have time off work. It takes a long time to recover. It can be really difficult to look after yourself. It can trigger other mental health conditions as well. So it's really important that we start to figure out in workplaces specifically, how can we address stress initially, not when we get to that pinch point. Now, just referring back to that definition, you'll see that this is a World Health Organization definition. And the really important thing to note here is that burnout is characterized by something in the workplace mainly. So again, when we look at organizations and how they should be managing or could be managing stress and burnout, it is the burden in a sense is very much on the workplaces themselves rather than the individual, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later into the presentation. So I've set the scene there hopefully for everyone, and hopefully we're kind of starting to understand what stress is, what happens when we don't deal with it. So I want to really quickly now come on to, okay, so how do we go ahead and address that? So I talked at the beginning about how I was going to present a model for stress and burnout, and this is it. So this is a model that I came across a long time ago. It's called the Illness Wellness Continuum, and it tends to be used on an individual level. So to briefly describe what that is, essentially down on the left-hand side of the continuum here, this is someone who has a particular condition, a diagnosable state of ill health. So we could look at this from a physical perspective, but today actually I want you to think of this from a mental health point of view. So someone down very far on the left hand side there is likely to be experiencing burnout or another mental health condition. So that person needs support to get them back to a point where they're feeling well, where they're no longer I guess suffering as a result of the condition they have. It is perfectly possible to have a mental health condition and be at the right hand end of this continuum, but you need that support in place to do that. So what we've got there, as you'll see just at the bottom, is we've got supportive interventions. That's the first thing I'll talk about today. We've also got people who are in this right hand side. So what you'll see here is that we can be anywhere from the neutral point all the way up until to high levels of wellness, flourishing, as we can call it as well. So at that neutral point, what we're looking to do is get people moved up as far as we can, up onto the high levels of wellness, where we're going to find people are generally more productive and generally just happier in day-to-day life. So we call those proactive interventions. They're interventions where we're trying to prevent people from going backwards, from going into the that kind of left-hand side of the spectrum, and we're trying to push people also up as far as we can into the high levels of wellness. Finally, we've got those educational interventions, which tend to be used across that whole spectrum. So anyone, wherever you put yourself on this scale, which by the way can be dynamic, you can change kind of day to day, week to week, but anyone on this scale can benefit from educational interventions. And that's because learning about things, learning how to deal with mental health conditions, learning just more about mental health conditions is really beneficial on an individual and a cultural level as well. So let's start off with looking at those supportive interventions then. So what we're looking at when we put in place a supportive intervention into a workplace, we're aiming to do a few different things. And to state the obvious, we're looking to support people. We're looking to have people who are experiencing a mental health condition here and now, and we're looking to understand how can we help them, how can we support them to get back into the workplace if that's something, if something has happened where they are no longer able to work. But how can we also help them to get back on that continuum and push them again right into that kind of higher levels of wellness, to a point where they're actually feeling not only kind of not suffering from their condition, but they're actually starting to feel well in themselves. So what we're also trying to do is minimize absence from the workplace at this point. So again, there's that individual level where we're starting to look at, we're trying to help that person just to feel well, but actually from a workplace point of view, we want to minimize the amount of time that they're spending outside of work. So how do we do this? Well, what I've done here, I guess I could do a whole presentation on supportive interventions and things that employers could or should be putting in place. But I've chosen 3 of the top things that are shown to be effective and fairly quick, I guess, I've called these quick wins to support people. And the first one on there that you'll see is professional support. A lot of employers are now getting EAPs, so employee assistance programs, which are really, really useful for people when they're at that point where they're experiencing a mental health condition. They need that support. They need someone, a professional like a counsellor, to talk to work through the particular thing that's going on for them at that time. If you don't have a professional who knows what they're talking about to speak with someone, yes, we can kind of rely on friends and family and all that sort of stuff, but actually from an organizational point of view, if we can provide that support to someone, it may be that we once again prevent them from having to go off work because we catch it early enough. It may be that we can have someone who can thrive even if they have an existing mental health condition, and we can help someone to deal with stress by having that professional support available. We also want to have supportive policies. So once again, a lot of workplaces now are starting to develop policies such as mental health policies, which outlines a few things in terms of things like how they view mental health, how mental health is viewed from the organization's point of view, kind of tolerance levels in terms of how we speak about mental health, the language that we use, but also the support that is in place for people with mental health problems. That can be really, really useful from an organizational point of view to say this is our stance on mental health and this is how we view it. And also things like return to work policies, we're going kind of more into the HR side of things there, which certainly isn't my kind of area of expertise, but in terms of policies, we want to make sure that people are supported back into work in a way that is useful for them. There's no good getting someone who's burnt out and then having a return to work policy which just isn't supportive and then them just going off straight away again. The final thing you'll see on there is manager mental health training. There's some really, really good research on the return on investment for these. So it tends to be the case that for every £1 spent on this, you get back as an organisation around about sort of £10 or so. Depending on which study you kind of look at. It makes sense, doesn't it? If we have leaders who understand mental health, we're much more likely to get people who notice when someone is showing signs of a mental health condition, if they've been trained in it, and also people who are able to have conversations about mental health, asking if people are okay. If people are very uncomfortable, if managers are uncomfortable with that and they can't have those conversations, it's really, really, I guess it makes sense, doesn't it, that we are less likely to be able to help people to manage those conditions. And we know at the moment that this is a really, really hot topic. People may be aware of a recent survey which was done where there was, I guess, a pool of people were surveyed, and it was found that 70% of people feel that their manager has more of an impact on their well-being and their mental health than someone like a therapist or a doctor, which again makes sense. We're seeing them so much more often. And they are there as a source of support. Moving on to the kind of proactive interventions then. So here's some of the key aims of proactive interventions. So what we want to do is support those people on that neutral point. So if we think back to that continuum, the term languishing comes to mind. So languishing is that point where we're neither well or ill. We're kind of just somewhere in the middle. We're getting on with life. We're kind of not particularly enjoying things, it's kind of this very sort of neutral point. And a lot of people tend to find themselves here. So one of the key aims of proactive intervention is actually just to support those people to feel really well and really productive in the workplace. Particularly after COVID, there was a lot of languishing going on where people who didn't particularly enjoy working from home, were kind of finding the lack of social contact, the lack of support from organisations was putting them to this state where they're kind of just going through the motions, but not particularly enjoying day-to-day, not being productive in their work. We also want to reduce that risk of people going back into that, or that requirement for those supportive interventions back onto the left-hand side of that spectrum. If we can reduce the risk of people going back to there by, once again, increasing people's coping resources or reducing the demands, and we'll talk a little bit about how organisations can do that from a cultural perspective later in the presentation, then once again, proactive interventions are being effective if that is kind of what's happening as a result. Increasing job satisfaction, increasing retention. Once again, if you have people who are well, who have their well-being prioritised and their mental health is considered in the workplace, we're much more likely to find that people are productive, but also they're going to stay in the organisation for longer because they're going to feel looked after. So some really good reasons to put these kind of interventions in place. And what I'd like to do here is just take a little bit of a step back, because to understand what proactive interventions to put in place, we actually kind of need to understand the problem itself first. So if we go back to burnout, we've already talked about this a little bit, but you'll remember that I brought up the World Health Organization definition of burnout, which included that idea that it's a organizational problem. Here's another quote, which is kind of similar in a way, but this is from someone called Michael Drayton, who wrote a book called Anti-Burnout. And he wrote this definition where I really like how this is worded, because it says burnout isn't an individual problem, it's an organizational problem that finds its expression in individuals. And that's where the confusion tends to be, that actually it is the individual who's experiencing this, so how could it possibly be an organizational problem? Well, he defines three areas that perfectly describe why that is the case. The first one of these is excessive collaboration. So this is one of the things which will, if not managed by an organization, will result in burnout. So what does this mean? Essentially, if we're having too many meetings, if we're having everyone involved in every single decision, that eats up so much time in the work day where we could be actually doing the work that we've been given. So what tends to happen in organizations is there's so many meetings, people's diaries are absolutely back to back, and as a result they feel overwhelmed because the work that they are being asked to actually do by themselves is not getting done. So there's a message here to say increase asynchronous communications. So an example of here in terms of reducing those meetings could be, when you're in a meeting, instead of going around and every single person giving a 5-minute update about what they've been doing, have a spreadsheet or something similar that everyone types up what they've been doing beforehand, and then in the meeting just ask people to talk about things that are a problem for them that they want resolving. There's an idea here, particularly in the tech world, that you should only have a meeting if you need to unblock something, rather than as something to update, which you can send in an email, or as something where you're just, it's not really required to actually talk things through. It could be communicated in an email. And that was something that I've started to use in my team probably kind of towards the end of last year, and I think it's had such a big impact. People can also use it as a procrastination tool as well. Oh, I'll just put in a meeting because I can't really be bothered to send this email, and it blocks out an hour of my time, and it means I haven't got to get on with that actual hard work. So be really aware of that. Second one is poor management of boundaries. So again, it sounds like this could be an individual problem, but actually when we look a little bit deeper into it, it's a cultural problem, because as an organization, there is a culture around what is expected. Everyone on this call will probably have worked in one or two or even more organizations where there's been slightly different culture, and possibly found yourselves kind of falling in line with that culture. So one organization, it may be that no one ever sends an email after 5 o'clock. Everyone sticks to their schedule, and that's exactly what everyone does, and that's just the norm. So that's what we do. Other organizations, it may be the culture that you're just expected to work till 9 o'clock at night on most evenings. And it's interesting, and the question around how this culture is formed, if I could answer that, then I'd be doing I'd be doing really, really well, because no one can answer that question. Every organisation is so different. So what we need to look at is what's going on, what's creating this culture. And a lot of the time it's going to be down to the leaders within the organisation. It's going to be down to what those expectations are. Looping back in with what we said before about line manager training, how important this is, and helping line managers to create an understanding. And when we talk about boundaries, again, it's that, particularly for home working now, it's really easy to have your laptop and go, oh, well, for example, I'm going to go to the gym on my lunch, which is a great thing to do. But then I'm going to come back and I'm going to work till 9 o'clock in the evening. There's no boundary there. So actually, there's something to suggest that actually having these really, really flexible policies could actually kind of be a bad thing in a way. But again, that, you know, the debate, the jury's out on that. Last one is overloading those capable team members. So again, I'm sure everyone on this call can think of a time, if you're a manager, if you've got someone in your team who fits this description, or if you maybe have been that person in the past where you're the conscientious, driven worker who wants to get everything done, who wants to impress. And it's really, really easy for those people to become victims, and I use that word purposely, victims of burnout. Because if you're conscientious, you want to get the work done, it's very unlikely that you're going to say no to things. And that's a real skill to be able to do that. But actually keeping on overloading those people who are really, really capable, all it's going to do is make their workload higher and higher and higher. Those people will aim to become more and more productive. If you're anything like me, I've looked into loads of like productivity hacks and all that sort of thing. And in the end, you reach your limit of productivity and people are still giving you work. It's that idea of, if you want something done, give it to the busiest person. What I'm suggesting here and what Michael Drayton is suggesting is actually don't do that. Look after those workers, because they're the ones that are most important for your organization to run effectively. So almost kind of reverse engineering those. The reason I've covered those for these proactive interventions is because we can go backwards. We can work back and say, okay, well, if we know that having too many meetings is a problem, well, clearly we need to look at reducing the number of meetings. So I've put a few things up here and we'll go through these. So one of the first things we can do is promote psychological safety. If people can actually speak up about problems they're having in the workplace, we are much less likely to have a culture of burnout, because people say, oh, actually, I'm starting to feel this way. I don't think this is necessary. I don't think this meeting is necessary. Psychological safety is all about creating an environment where people feel like they can speak up. So if we can foster that in an organization, that means essentially we can address poor work practices straight away rather than letting them play out. Reducing the number of meetings, we've already touched on this. We know that having too many meetings is a big problem and it doesn't allow us to focus on our work. Boundaries. Talked a little bit about boundaries, but actually there was a really, and this was a talk I attended a couple of years ago, where it was actually Michael Drayton himself who wrote that book, who said, if there's one thing you do after this talk, go away to your organizations and put a rule in place that you don't send emails after 7 p.m. I would class this as a bit of a nudge, because you're not saying to people you can't work after 7 p.m. You're encouraging people not to work after 7 p.m. They could delay their emails. They could, if they really, really wanted to, but it's all about that culture change, because as soon as people aren't receiving emails after that time, it allows people to switch off. As we know, people will get these kind of notifications and things on their phone, and it can be really, really difficult to avoid that, essentially, even late on in the evenings. Ensuring adequate work and rest. So again, this is a cultural thing. Does your manager take a lunch break? Because if they don't, well, then you're probably not going to feel like you can take a lunch break either. So there's lots of things organizations can do to support work, rest, and it's really around that culture. But there's also things that I've seen in certain organizations, such as wellbeing days, having lots of a good amount of annual leave for people to take. So when they feel burnt out, they're not thinking, I've only got this many days left and I want to use that to go on holiday. Actually, they feel like they've got enough so that they can go, okay, I can do my holiday, but I could also take this extra day off because I'm feeling a little bit stressed and burnt out. We need that time to rest. So again, it can be a positive. And I guess it's that idea that it can feel counterproductive because people are out of work more often because they're on annual leave. But actually, the net effect is we get more productive people who are actually going to end up being in work for longer in the end. I've talked through here a bit of a thread about senior leadership and managers looking after their own well-being. Again, that's going to drive culture change. People look up to those in more senior positions. So if they see people in senior positions not looking after themselves, working all hours under the sun, that's going to mean that that filters down to the rest of the organisation. And finally, promoting autonomy within the workplace. That's pulled kind of directly from the health and safety executive. So management standards, if anyone hasn't come across those, I'd recommend taking a look. There's a list of 6 standards for managing stress in the workplace, and autonomy is one of those, which is really, really important. It actually kind of fits with this idea of meetings and all that sort of stuff. Let people say no to meetings, let people manage their own time, whilst also giving that nudge to create themselves some boundaries, and that's where good leadership comes in. So we talked about that. Educational interventions was that last one. So that's, again, covering all people. So anyone can benefit from an educational intervention, particularly managers. We talked about supportive interventions and how it's really important for managers to have educational interventions and training to help them understand mental health and have conversations around mental health. But what it can also do is help to drive cultural change. The reason is because if we increase awareness of mental health, awareness of how to deal with certain mental health problems, then that can be really, really useful for helping people to manage their own stresses. And it can create a culture where people just feel open to talk about mental health. It's, in my experience, it's getting a lot better. People are much better at talking about mental health and destigmatizing it. But actually, there's a lot of organizations still out there where there isn't that open culture. People don't feel comfortable to go to the line manager and say, actually, I'm really struggling here. Doing those educational interventions, having some training on it can be really, really useful and really eye-opening to support that. So we've got that idea of training. How do we manage that? This is my favorite slide of the presentation, how not to integrate learning. So this is kind of what a lot of organizations do. They'll send their employees on a training course and then kind of look at each other quite awkwardly, not really understanding what to do next. So what I would propose is there's a slightly better way of doing it. So starting at the top left, we firstly need to understand the gaps. If there could be things that your organization is really, really good at. Maybe everyone just sleeps really, really well and they're really good at prioritizing that, for example. So understand the gaps, give people that time outside of work. Most organizations will do this, and then ask what the learnings are off the back of that course. So people have gone on a course, and I'm going to use mental health first aid as an example here because it's probably the one people are most familiar with, but it's also one that fits nicely into this example. So if you send a load of people on mental health first aid, they come back to the organization and they are mental health first aiders. They're trained over 2 days to support people to have a basic conversation around mental health. Perfect. And there's a little bit integrated into that course around actually how do you kind of bring that back to your organization? Great. However, if you have a load of mental health first aiders, but nobody actually knows that they're mental health first aiders, it kind of defeats the object of sending them on that training. So what we need to do then is we need to work with the people who've attended the course, potentially create a network, a Teams chat or whatever that looks like, Slack if anyone uses that, and develop a plan of how are we actually going to disseminate this information out now. So what are the key learnings from the course? What are the key points where you look at your own organization and go, oh, actually, I learned this on the course and I don't think we do that very well at the minute. Speak to those people, have a little bit of a working group and develop a plan of how you're going to do that. Are you, for example, going to have every single mental health first aider put it in their signature? Are you going to send a mass email out to the whole organization detailing who your mental health first aiders are? Where are you going to advertise it? So there's some sort of plan. Give those people support, give those people that space, that allow that time, out of their usual working day to work on this stuff. And then most importantly, measure the impact afterwards and make sure that whatever you've done on that course, whatever you've put in place has actually increased people's awareness of whatever the aim of the course you've gone and allow people to attend, what's been the effect of that. So yeah, that's how we can use training to actually drive culture change. And this is just a list of courses. that you may consider in an organisation. This is absolutely not an exhaustive list by any means, but I've mentioned mental health first aid. Suicide awareness is a really common one at the minute, and it can be really useful, even if it only saves one or two lives a year. It's such a great idea to have at least a few people who have an understanding of that. Line managed mental health, I've talked about that quite a lot now. And then we've also got those preventative things as well. So when we look at proactive interventions, things like stress and resilience training, particularly for leaders who we tend to find are the ones who have high levels of stress. General well-being, exercise, nutrition, people increasing those coping skills. If we go back to that model of stress, we've got our demands. So we're training our line managers to manage people's demands, but we're also then training people on an individual level to increase their coping skills through exercise, nutrition, all those areas of well-being that we're all familiar with. So that's our interventions. Okay, so hopefully everyone's kind of find that useful. And what I'd encourage you to do at this point is just have a little bit of a think about which of those interventions could you take back into your organization. Okay, so final little bit of the presentation now. We're going to have a little bit of a look at how you can actually take these interventions back into your organization in an effective way. I've gone on so much about line managers, but I'm going to do it a little bit more. So as a line manager, if you are a line manager, dial into this call today, there are 3 things that you need to consider as part of managing your direct reports and their mental health. You need to firstly effectively manage. So what that essentially means is you're managing people's demands, you're managing people's workloads, you're having regular one-to-ones with people, you're effectively, I always kind of think of it as a little bit of a game of chess, being in a kind of leadership position where you're getting the resource and allocating it kind of in a way that works for everyone. Something that I do with my team is that I'll ask them every 2 weeks, I'll say, are you red, amber or green in terms of your workload at the minute? And then what I can do is if someone's a red, we can say, okay, well, what work could someone who's a green take? If everyone's a red, then that's a different conversation. But again, that effective resource allocation can be really, really useful to help people, again, just reduce those demands in the working environment. Spotting the signs. So actually, if we don't know what the sign, this is where the mental health training comes in for leaders. If you can't spot the signs, if you don't actually know what the signs of burnout and stress are, then you can't know when someone's feeling that way. You can't kind of call it out and see it. So the thing is about being a line manager is that you know someone fairly well. You know, you're probably meeting up with them fairly regularly and you probably know what's normal for them. So you might just get someone who's quite a shy person who doesn't talk a lot, and that's fine. But if your best performing, very talkative, bubbly employee suddenly becomes very withdrawn, you're going to be thinking, okay, I need to have a conversation with them about their mental health, which again, training can be really useful. And that's the next point just here. Can you have an effective conversation with your employees about mental health, or do you feel really awkward about it? Because a lot of people do. So again, this is where training can come in. And what we want to look to do as a line manager is create a plan for that person. So asking them questions about, okay, how is your mental health? What can I do to support? And what's worked for you in the past? These kind of questions can be really, really useful just to help someone develop a plan, have those regular check-ins, being empathetic and knowing actually what's there in your organization. If you're a leader, again, one of your jobs really is to understand what's out there. Do you have an EAP? What other wellbeing support is actually in place at the minute? Because then you can pass that information on to them. And that fits with this acronym here. Again, if you're a leader, if you're a manager, this is a really, really nice kind of way of structuring any conversation you have with someone. So you're spotting the signs, we said that. We're listening non-judgmentally to someone. Again, a lot of mental health and stress is really about just understanding what someone's going through and kind of absorbing that a little bit. You can then offer that support. So again, not understanding, do you have an EAP? Do you have mental health first aiders? Do you have other support across the organisation that's going to help people in a particular position? Professional help, again, we said EAP, and signposting to GPs, signposting to kind of, I guess, anyone, your counsellors, all that sort of stuff, anyone that you've got access to. And then encouraging other wellbeing support. So again, if you've got an employee who is saying, yeah, you know, I'm feeling really stressed, and you ask the question, okay, is there anything that you're doing that could support that? And the answer is no. It would be a case of having the conversation around, okay, well, you know, how can I help you to look after yourself? You know, is it that you need to start work a little bit later so you can have a line because you're struggling with your sleep? Is it that you know, we need to block out periods of your diary where you can go off and do a gym session? So again, as a line manager, you have a lot of sway on how someone manages their time. And underneath there, it says, you know, if you're really, really concerned about someone, you've got the safety net of 999. If you're having a conversation with someone about something like suicide, then clearly, yeah, it's an emergency situation. You can use 999. In terms of that kind of first bit of spotting the signs, I thought I'd include in the presentation today, and I'm going to kind of glance over this, but spotting the signs of something like burnout. Again, as a manager, we really want to know what those signs are so we can support people. So really, really quickly, there's three kind of key things you're going to see. You're going to see people feeling exhausted. You're going to see people detaching from the job and reducing their performance as well. So these are all signs of someone starting to move towards burnout, someone who may have already been experiencing stress. And incidentally, these are also symptoms of someone kind of just not engaging with their role. So a lot of the time we'll tend to put people through performance management procedures when they start to reduce their performance. So next time you do get someone in your team who is not performing, who's not doing particularly well in their role, be empathetic, be curious in what's going on for them, because it may be that you don't want to performance manage them. You actually want to have a conversation about their mental health. Finally, tips for behaviour change. So I've talked a lot today about interventions, but what we haven't talked about is how to put those interventions in place. So just some really quick tips here on actually how do you make changes in an organisation from a cultural point of view. So if anyone's heard of the book Nudge, it's a great book, recommend it. Nudges essentially are ways of pushing someone in a certain direction without being dictative. People don't like being told what to do. So things like policies, for example, are great. But actually, if we can nudge people, for example, don't do no emails after 7 p.m. That I would class that as a nudge, because you're not telling people they can't work after that point. We're just putting something in place to push people in the direction of not doing that. Another really good example from a wellbeing point of view is only having a couple of smoking areas on your site. So you're not saying people can't smoke, but you're saying that they have to walk quite a long way to do it. And again, that's usually a lot of the time it's enough to deter people. There's a lot of research around nudges, so recommend having a look at that if you're interested. And that book in particular is a good starting point. Consider pinch points. So what we tend to find from a cultural point of view is that there's usually one or two areas where if you address them, then it will have a knock-on effect on other areas. I see this a lot as a coach doing one-to-one sessions with people. So it may be, for example, that someone's not sleeping very well, they're not exercising because they can't be, they're not motivated, they can't be bothered, they're not eating very well. But actually, at the center of all that is stress, and at the center of the stress is their work and their boundaries, for example. So what we can say there is, if they were to address that one thing, it's likely that all the others would change as well. And we can apply that into an organization and say there might be something in an organization that's a pinch point, which if you just change that one thing, it would have a domino effect on everything else. Another thing when we talk about kind of change management in particular is involving employees in decision-making processes. People may have come across this idea before, but again, if we're trying to change culture, having working groups can be really, really useful so that people at least feel and actually are involved in those decisions to put particular things in place. Having wellbeing champions is a great intervention because it gets employees involved. You understand what people on the ground actually want, and that can be a more effective way of putting things into place rather than kind of just dictating, we think you need this. And then we've talked about support and training in terms of increasing people's confidence as well. So just to finish off then, just the top 3 tips going away from today, and top 3 kind of learnings, I would say, more than anything. That obviously we've covered a lot. We've talked about a lot of different interventions and how they're categorized, models of stress. So I've packed quite a lot into the presentation today. I'm fully conscious and aware of that. But yeah, some three key take homes today. So high stress occurs when our demands exceed our coping. Remember that, keep that in mind, and keep that in mind of, ask yourself the question, if you're experiencing stress or a team member is, what are their demands and what are their coping skills, and how could I alter both of those? Burnout is an organizational problem, not an individual one. So again, if someone is becoming tired and their performance is going down, and you say, actually, it feels like this person might be burnt out, think about, as an organization, what might be going wrong. And then finally, line managers. I feel like I've definitely hit that point home, but line managers play a really pivotal role in employee mental health. So really considering, as a line manager, what is it that I can do? Use those 3 boxes that I put up on the screen about kind of that idea of listening and understanding, and also kind of that effective management as well, and that ability to understand what the triggers might be and how to spot the signs. These are all really useful things to have in your toolkit as a line manager if you're helping to support the mental health of your employees. So thank you for listening. Hopefully that's been useful, and I would welcome any questions.
Simon, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us today. And just before I share some information on this slide and go to some of the questions that we've had through, just wanted to let you know, you probably wouldn't have seen this, but just after you got started, we had a comment shared by one of the audience saying, I think this is in relation to my Wi-Fi completely dropping out, but everything that has gone wrong this morning is a typical example of how to manage stress. These things happen, with a smiley face. It's all about keeping calm and keeping people informed, so well done. So I think we can take a little bit of credit for knowing a little bit about stress management and being able to manage that as a situation. And yeah, thank you. I think it was Lorna that submitted that as a comment. Thank you for sharing that feedback. And so just, I won't spend too much time just on this slide, just to quickly mention that as per normal with this webinar series, we're doing it on a monthly basis. As you've attended this webinar as an audience member, you are able to access a 30-minute complimentary consultation with one of our wellbeing experts. To do that, all you need to do is just scan the QR code on the screen, or you can actually fill out the form after the webinar, which you should receive via a survey link. And we will happily oblige. And obviously, we do have our standard social media channels, which you can follow. If you want to get in touch with Simon as well, you can also just contact us through the email address that is on the screen along the bottom, and we'll be able to put you in touch with Simon. Simon, just wanted to make a comment as well regarding the 2 of the 3 things that you mentioned in your key takeaways from today's session. That burnout is, of course, an area that we need to be taking seriously as organizations, but also line managers need to be able to have the skills to be able to support their employees. Well, recently there was some research that was released that showed that when you look at those within an organization that are experiencing the most amount of burnout, if you separate them out into different positions within an organization, that it's actually those that have people management responsibilities that at the moment are having the highest levels of burnout. And so is there anything that you would recommend organizations to do specifically to support their line managers in addressing burnout as well?
Yes, good question. And I think by going on these courses and understanding mental health, you can firstly start to notice it in yourself as a line manager. And then once you start to notice it in yourself, you start to understand it more, you have more empathy with others, but you can also manage it as well. So something like mental health first aid does give you those skills to understand how to manage your own well-being. It was something that was recognised, and there's been a change in mental health first aid recently, actually, which has reflected that. I think also, even as a line manager, you also have a line manager most of the time. So it's about using them and understanding their how they can support you as well. So once again, we've talked about how line managers have such a big influence on things like workload. And if you are someone who is experiencing stress as a result of having too much work, but you are a line manager yourself, you've still got, most people will have someone who is still their line manager who they can go to. And actually, again, if we look at culturally, I've talked a little bit about in the presentation about how if you do something yourself as a line manager, other people tend to follow. If you can be really open with your team and say, actually, I access this support through my line manager, then that again is going to actually be quite useful to drive that cultural change. I was talking about how I do the red, amber, green with my team. I do that as well. I tell them where I'm at, and sometimes I've told them, yeah, you know what, this week I'm red. So just having that openness, I would say, actually can be, you know, spun as a positive.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Simon. And I won't, although I've got loads more questions that I want to ask you, I'm actually going to allow the Q&A to come from, or the questions rather, to come from our audience. So, David, did we have any questions submitted by the audience that we can ask Simon?
Yes, Marcus, we do. We've got quite a few, actually. I'm not sure we'll be able to answer all of them, but those that we don't get to answer today, we'll endeavour to provide some feedback on post-event via communications. But here's a really good one, actually. What options are available to people who don't work for a large company and don't have access to an EAP? I crashed and burned in September 2019 and have no access to an EAP as I am self-employed.
Excellent question. Really, really good question. The reason it's an interesting question for me is I mentioned that I'm at York Mind. Most of York, I can't remember the percentage, but most of York, if anyone's been to York or lives in York, it's all small businesses. So we're actually kind of one of my key jobs is to figure out how we can support small businesses. So from our perspective, I guess we, you know, as Mind, we sort of look at what services can we put in place. So there are organisations, obviously you've got the NHS and various other charities who offer things like counselling at a reduced rate. So it may be that you go ahead and access that yourself, with the knowledge that, yeah, you might have to pay a little bit for yourself, but at least there is that kind of community level of support there, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's probably the main area that you're going to want to look at. I guess again, it's encouraging those smaller organisations to see how they can support people. We're developing something at the moment for again businesses in York, which we're hoping will be really useful, some information access. So I guess look in your local area, understand what services there are for small businesses, and maybe flag that to your employer and say, you know, I've noticed we haven't got much in place at the minute. Is this something you consider doing for us? And then, as I say, on an individual level, really understanding what else is out there in your local area. It's very likely that there's going to be some sort of counselling that's either discounted or free that you can go ahead and access.
Excellent. Okay, different perspective with this question. As the managing director of a business supporting employees throughout the day, I find myself spending evenings and weekends working in and on the business. How do you advise is the best way forward?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, what this person's saying is that they're spending all their time in the workday managing people, and then the actual stuff that needs doing to run the business is on the weekends. Is that what the question's?
So that's exactly it. Yes.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Again, this for me comes down to a boundaries related thing. I don't know how big this person's organization is or anything like that. I guess it's understanding the reason we have line managers is because if every single person in an organization reported to the managing director or the CEO, as you say, they just wouldn't have the time to deal with that. So I guess understanding your workload and it sounds like you've got some insights there as to where your time is going in terms of workload and managing that. I would probably look at where else could that support be. So for example, if you're finding that there's loads of people who are really, really burnt out, one, what can you do to address that? But two, where could you outsource that support? So are the people who need to be kind of below your position, I guess, who are line managing people in here? So that I guess you've got more line managers to spread that workload a little bit more evenly across the organization. In terms of outsourcing, again, things like employee assistance programs, if you're finding that there's a lot of people coming to you and saying, I'm really burnt out and I need some more support, well, as a line manager, you know, there's got to be a boundary there on exactly what support you give. You can't speak to every single person every single day. It's just not possible because, as you say, you then end up burning out yourself. And there's that idea of putting, you know, when you're on an aeroplane, put your oxygen mask on first. It's kind of, you've got to apply that way of thinking. So outsourcing that support to something like an employee assistance program, and also in the background working on the culture and maybe assigning a person or a group of people to understand how can we improve the culture here, because everyone seems to be getting burnt out.
Great, thanks, Simon. I think that's
Simon, I'll just add to that as well. That David, sorry, I was just going to quickly add to that. That I think interestingly, this question in a way kind of relates to the definition of stress that you shared, Simon. That actually a stressor in itself is ultimately dependent on the perception of the individual. And so if an individual does actually benefit from or get enjoyment out of supporting team members and then, you know, working on weekends or in the evenings, if that's something that is in line with their perception of not being a stressor, then it may not be an issue. However, if it is a stressor, then it comes down to the old adage of, you know, sharpening the saw. That if you go up to somebody and you notice that they're trying to cut down a tree with a blunt saw, and you advise them that if you sharpen that saw, you'll cut down the tree quicker, and then the response is, I haven't got time to sharpen my saw, it's all about investing in yourself in order to then have a ripple effect on those that you're supporting.
Great stuff. Thanks, Marcus. I think, unfortunately, we're actually out of time now. So I'll just draw everything to a close by saying that we've had a lot of questions about slides and recordings of the presentation. They will both be available post-event, and you'll be sent details in an email after this session. And I'd also just like to flag up next month's Being Well Together webinar, which is focusing on well-being in the manufacturing environment. And that is scheduled for Tuesday, the 30th of May. So we'd love to have you on board for that one as well. And with that, I'll draw everything to a close. I'd like to thank you for your attendance today. We've had fantastic numbers here and fantastic questions as well, which we will follow up with you post-event. So thanks all, and we'll see you at the next installment. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Marcus.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Simon.